Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Nora. I'm a part of the program team at the Princeton Public Library, and we are very pleased to bring you tonight this evening's presentation, Memory and the Woman Suffragists of New Jersey, in partnership with the Historical Society of Princeton. Thank you very much for joining us. At the bottom of your screen is a Q&A button, and we please ask that you add your questions there at any point during the presentation. And following the presentation, we will get to those questions with Anne. We also have the chat open. Please feel free to add your thoughts there. You can direct your chats to all panelists and attendees to make sure that everyone can join in the same conversation. Both the library and the Historical Society continue to provide programs and services, as we hope you are all aware. Please visit us at princetonlibrary.org and princetonhistory.org for more details. And to help us get started, I am very pleased to introduce Izzy Casden, the Executive Director of the Historical Society of Princeton. Izzy?
Thank you so much, Nora. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here this evening with us. We're so excited to host Professor Anne Gordon for this lecture tonight alongside the Princeton Public Library. A friendly reminder that this lecture is presented in conjunction with our digital exhibition, which is available right now today and forever into the future, as long as the internet exists, on our website, The Greatest Question of the Day, Princeton and Women's Suffrage. And so that's available on both the Historical Society and the library's websites. I'm gonna go ahead and put a link in the chat when I finish speaking. So if you're interested in zooming into this story even more than we will today, no pun intended, we encourage you to check that out. And like I said, I'll share the link in the chat. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Anne Gordon. Dr. Gordon is a research professor emerita of history, retired from Rutgers University. A graduate of Smith College, she earned her Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in early American history. From 1982 until her retirement, she edited the papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, published first as a 45-reel microfilm edition, and then she completed a 6-volume selected papers from the collection in 2013. She has written numerous articles in women's history and biography and edited a collection of essays by scholars of Black history, African-American women and the vote, 1837 to 1965 in 1997. Dr. Gordon has been an active scholar in this centennial year of the 19th Amendment. This 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which enabled women to vote for the first time. Or in some places for the first time, as you will soon learn. Her essay on the 19th Amendment appears in the National Park Service's website publication, 19th Amendment and Women's Access to the Vote Across America. She served as a historical advisor to the National Archives in preparing its suffrage centennial exhibit, Rightfully Hers, which is also partially available online, and I encourage you to check that out as well. And until the pandemic, she lectured often on the history of voting rights. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Gordon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm assuming this will change. Thank you very much for coming out this evening or zooming in or whatever our verbs are to be at this point. I'm speaking, as they've said, on Memory and the Woman Suffragists of New Jersey. New Jersey occupies a unique place in the American history of voting rights. We think we know that for 31 years, white women, Black women, and Black men could qualify to vote as equals, provided they possessed the necessary sum of money. On July 2nd, 1776, in anticipation of the Declaration of Independence, delegates to a provincial Congress held in Burlington drew up a constitution for an independent New Jersey. Here's what they agreed should be the qualification of voters. And here we're going to go into the world of share screen, and it takes a certain amount of work. Whoops, back. Okay, so here's what they agreed. All inhabitants of this colony of full age who are worth 50 pounds proclamation money, clear a state in the same and have resided within the county in which they claim a vote for 12 months immediately preceding the election shall be entitled to vote for representatives in council and assembly, and also for all other public officers that shall be elected by the people of the county at large. In crafting a design for government without a king, they had this new mission, don't forget. Those men said nothing of race or gender in that statement. They chose the word inhabitants, a noun about residing in a particular place. Until recently, historians have relied on very small bits of evidence to figure out how the word inhabitants was understood in 18th century New Jersey. The best clues, it turned out, were in plain sight in legislation. In 1790 and again in 1797, legislators enacted rules for better conduct of their elections. And here is the language from the bill passed in February 1797. Every voter shall openly and in full view deliver his or her ballot, which shall be a single written ticket containing the names of the person or persons for whom he or she votes. That's pretty good evidence that men recognized what had been wrought, that they resided in a state where he or she might come to the polls. Despite such evidence, it was still reasonable to ask, did women actually take advantage of this opportunity? Did women vote? When it is possible, I recommend, when it is possible to make the trip, do visit the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia to see its exhibit about women voting in New Jersey, based on terrific new evidence. I have not been able to visit it, though I've heard the curators talk about their work and read about the research in the New York Times. They're promising an online version of the exhibit, but there's still no date offered for that, delivering that. But here is an example of what they found. In that law of 1797, it was stated that polling places should keep a notebook divided into columns in which to record the names of inhabitants as they voted. And this is a segment of such a page from Somerset County in 1801 with the names of women who cast ballots. And if you notice, you can't read every letter necessarily, but if you notice, as the staff did, the women's names are clustered. We have Stephen Voorhees, we have Peter Carr, and then we have Katie, Nellie, Mary, Elizabeth, Beth, and then it goes back to John. Or no, it's Ruth, I'm sorry, that would be a Ruth, I think. The question comes up, did women enter the polling place together? Did this become something social that women did? And this is just one part of one page of what these researchers have found for the first time. It certainly looks like women knew the potential in the word inhabitants. The era of voting unrestricted by race or gender ended in 1807 with a law passed by a majority in a room full of white men. Though it left the constitutional language unamended, thereafter, to be an eligible voter in New Jersey, one needed to be a citizen, a white person, and a male person. Why did this happen? Answers to that question come in many varieties and have since the 19th century. The noted suffragist Lucy Stone, while she was a state resident, addressed the legislature in 1867 about restoring the vote to women and African-American men, and offered a rather crude explanation for why the law of 1807 happened. The later settlers of New Jersey were far inferior to the original Quaker and Puritan elements which controlled the Constitutional Convention of 1776. Her husband was fond of a similar explanation. A more temperate explanation offered by a number of scholars points to our history of, and you won't be surprised because it's very familiar these weeks, our history of changing the boundaries of who's in and who's out when it comes to voting rights. And this New Jersey story is, excuse me, and I quote the late historian Jan Lewis, quote, part of the process by which Americans defined the boundaries of their political community in the decades immediately after the revolution. But it would be a mistake, I think, to overlook the conviction that women simply did not belong at the polls, not as a sole explanation, but definitely a contributing factor. The Federalist William Griffith, a staunch opponent of the Constitution of 1776 for many different reasons, wanted a smaller, whiter, and male electorate. Writing under his pseudonym, he opined, and I'll just show you the cover of his collection of complaints about that Constitution, that he wrote, to my mind, it is evident that women generally are neither by nature, nor habit, nor education, nor by their necessary condition in society, fitted to perform this duty of voting with credit to themselves or advantage to the public. We have to face the fact that patriarchy had its day in 1807. No uprising of the women occurred when men changed the rules. To date, no one has found protests, petitions, or court challenges in the immediate aftermath. There are hints in the historical record that in some parts of the states, women may have continued to vote, at least on occasion. But lack of evidence about an uprising must not be mistaken for amnesia or erasure. This history did not down. I did not learn about these decades when I was an historian of 18th century colonial America. I learned about them when I was editing the papers of 19th century activists in the women's suffrage movement. If you edit historical records, you are, in a sense, at the mercy of your principles. Elizabeth Cady Stanton brings up the subject of New Jersey's women who once voted and then lost the vote, and you have an assignment. What on earth is she talking about? So I came at this subject of New Jersey's utopian moment long before the 2020 centennial through people's memories of it, people's histories of it, and their political uses of that history. New Jersey's early experiment with Republican government lived on as an historical memory of quite some significance into the 20th century. It is this afterlife of the history that I want to talk about. In the 19th century, the New Jersey story complicated efforts to define who were citizens of the US and who had responsibility for voting rights, both factors affecting women suffragists. And for that reason, the history surfaced at least twice in cases before the Supreme Court of the United States. The first concerned the citizenship of African Americans. In the infamous Dred Scott case decided in 1857, a majority of the court ruled that Scott, an African American man, formerly a slave, was not a citizen, and what's more, could not become one. No one of African descent, slave or free, could become a citizen, according to Chief Justice Roger Taney. In the narrowest consequence of that ruling, Dred Scott did not have standing to sue in federal courts without his citizenship. And how was that conclusion reached? In the words of the majority opinion, it becomes necessary to determine who were citizens of the several states when the Constitution was adopted. We must inquire who at that time were recognized as the people or citizens of a state. Before you hear Tawny's answer, I'll show you Tawny's fate. He's been one of the victims of the statue history memory revolution of the last few years. In Tawny's opinion, the court, overlooking some facts of the matter, concluded this: that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves, nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as a part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. In his dissenting opinion in the case, Associate Justice Benjamin Curtis pointed out an error in that conclusion. At the time of the ratification of the Articles of Confederation, all free native-born inhabitants of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and North Carolina, though descended from African slaves, were not only citizens of those states, but such of them as had the other necessary qualifications possessed franchise of electors on equal terms with other citizens. He also remarked that in New Jersey, there were undoubtedly free inhabitants of African descent who voted on the Constitution's adoption. The second time the New Jersey case comes before the Supreme Court is in 1875 on questions about constitutional rights of women. It was in a case brought by Francis and Virginia Minor of St. Louis. This couple emerged after the Civil War as very important legal advisors to and actors in the women's suffrage movement. And pursuant to their own advice and their own understanding of the Constitution, that women were in fact already voters after the Civil War under the Constitution as amended, Virginia tried to register to vote to make the point that she was already a voter, was refused registration and took the matter to court, eventually reaching the Supreme Court on appeal. In the unanimous opinion in Minor v. Happersett, justices took a familiar path. They did exactly what the earlier justices did. It is necessary to ascertain what persons originally associated themselves together to form the nation, and what were afterwards admitted to membership. That use of the word membership in lieu of citizenship became a hot button issue in the aftermath of this ruling. The Minors had argued that suffrage was a privilege of US citizenship and protected from state action. No, said the justices. States came into the Union excluding citizens from voting, and they still possessed that right. That right to exclude, remember. These justices had at least done the homework. They included in the opinion the suffrage requirements in the 13 original states that adopted the Constitution. And they concluded, as has been seen, all the citizens of the states were not invested with the right of suffrage. In all, save perhaps New Jersey, the right was only bestowed on men and not upon all of them. Save perhaps New Jersey. It's my favorite phrase of 2020. To Garden State suffragists, there was no perhaps about it. People had memories. People kept talking. We can conjecture, we have enough hints to do so, that the generation of disfranchised women talked about the Golden Age to younger women in the same generation that built a national movement for women's rights. Knowledge of the history influenced the mission and tactics of New Jersey's suffrage movement. It informed a political culture among activist women here and nationally. If your mother voted and then lost that chance, it's likely you grew up knowing that history. There is printed evidence of such oral transmission. The Reverend Antoinette Blackwell, a New Jersey resident, told an audience in the 1870s, "I have neighbors whose mothers and grandmothers voted, and who are beginning to recall that fact with pride and satisfaction." Julia Ward Howe, born in 1819, and that's relevant to the story, recalled in a speech when in her 50s that as a child in New York City, so let's say the 1820s, early 1830s, she knew about New Jersey's voting women. Considering that her father was a prominent banker with marital and business ties to the region's best families, it seems likely that among her parents' friends were disfranchised voters of New Jersey, white ones anyway. We don't know that the Black disfranchised came to the Ward House. Lucy Stone, who moved to New Jersey in the 1850s, recalled an elderly acquaintance in East Orange, a Mr. Cyrus Jones, born, she said, in 1770. He says, she told an audience, that old maids, widows, and unmarried women very frequently voted, but married women very seldom. That the right was recognized and very little said or thought about it in any way. There's clearly oral traditions across the 19th century on the New Jersey story. These traditions were probably at play when New Jersey held a constitutional convention in 1844 to replace the one of 1776. Petitioners sought what was in effect the restoration of those early voting rights, though the convention's official record avoids the word restore. Two petitions from, quote, colored citizens of the state asked that, quote, they may not be excluded by the Constitution from exercising the right of suffrage. A few weeks later, a petition from citizens of Burlington County asked, quote, that the right of suffrage be extended to women. Do the math. Petitioners in 1844 could have voted before 1807, and certainly could know people who did so. Maybe it is no accident that this, the earliest formal plea for women's suffrage, happened here, even if, in this case, men of goodwill signed the petition. All the petitions were tabled without discussion by that convention in 44 and without referral to a committee. The Constitution emerging from the convention enshrined the language of the law of 1807, a minority government of white male citizens. Before long, this history was making its way into the political culture of the rising movement for women's rights. It's possible actually to hear through a newspaper report an occasion when it was broadcast to the movement in 1853 to thousands of people in New York's Broadway Tabernacle for a state women's rights convention. And so you don't think that, whoops, oh, I meant to show you that, I'm sorry. My notes to myself were bad. There's the language from the 1844 Constitution, every white male citizen. I wanted to show you what Broadway Tabernacle looks like when the secular meetings are held there. This is 1853. That's a pretty big space for a women's rights movement so early in the cause, and the newspapers describe it as full. 2,400 was its stated capacity, although we got some standees back here against the railing. The Unitarian Reverend John Pierpont of Massachusetts made his first appearance at any women's rights meeting there at Broadway Tabernacle. And being pretty proud of himself, he told the multitude a story about his conversion to the cause. He had been passing through New Jersey some 40 years ago, he said, and stopping for dinner at an inn where the coach stopped, I saw at the bar when I went to pay a list of the voters of the town stuck up. My eye ran over it, and I read, to my astonishment, the names of several women. What, I said, do women vote here? Certainly, was the answer, when they have real estate. His details are off. 1853 minus 40 years ago would be 1813, after women took the vote, lost the vote. And it wasn't real estate that women needed, just cash money or its equivalent. But he recovered and reframed for this audience an important piece of history directly relevant to their own mission as reformers for women's rights. A memory of women voting in this state gained power in proportion to the growth of that movement, and the memory itself began to meet opposition. An early historical account was delivered to members of the New Jersey Historical Society in January 1858 by its corresponding secretary, William Whitehead. Whitehead told his audience that he could find no evidence of women taking advantage of that word inhabitants, nothing to indicate that they understood the term to be inclusive. The first legislation to use the he or she language, that of 1790, produced, he told his audience, no cases of female voting by virtue of this more definite provision. Whitehead is so sure that women did not avail themselves of this privilege or right, he decides that the existence of the he or she language in the legislation of 1797 is in itself evidence that women had not voted. Why? Because if women had voted before 1797, quote, its evil consequences would otherwise have become apparent. And goes on to explain, they wouldn't have repeated the mistake of saying he or she if anybody had been using it. The first instance of female voters he acknowledges was in 1797, and it was a disgrace. Women were made pawns of partisan politics and dragged to the polls, and men dressed themselves up as women to cast multiple ballots. And no woman voted again, he was sure, until 1800, when politicians exploited women yet again for partisan gains in that year's presidential election. It was and is perfectly clear that the precedent of women voting in New Jersey worried Mr. Whitehead. Adopting the royal we, he settled the historical question, did women vote in New Jersey? We are warranted in believing that the women of New Jersey then as now were not about to overstep the bounds of decorum or intrude where their characteristic modesty and self-respect might be wounded. Why in the winter of 1857 and 58 did Whitehead turn his attention to this subject? He singled out and mocked one recent event in New Jersey, Lucy Stone's first tax protest in January 1857. He was appalled that she had used the argument, no taxation without representation. If Benjamin Curtis were shining a light on the generous provisions of New York's early Constitution just months before Whitehead spoke, Whitehead would assure people that the brief moment when some women voted in New Jersey was aberrant. As it is very evident that when in times past the right was not only claimed but exercised in New Jersey, it never accorded with public sentiment. So it may be safely predicted that, as was the case in 1807, and he's quoting the preamble to the law of 1807, the safety, quiet, good order, and dignity of the state will ever call for its explicit disavowal in times to come. The new agitation for women's rights was spreading much too fast for Mr. Whitehead. Leaders in the new women's rights movement were not fooled by his angle on history, but they took advantage of his research. When Lucy Stone addressed the legislature at the same speech in 1867, she mentioned Whitehead's essay and his prejudices, but she rejected his conclusions. We've had this right. We have exercised it. It has been unjustly and illegally taken away without our consent, without us being allowed to say a word in our own defense. Editors of the History of Women's Suffrage, Volume 1, published in 1881, chose to include Whitehead's entire essay and gave equal space to detailing its flaws. The New Jersey story was becoming a part of how women suffragists understood both their mission and its obstacles. Here is one of the state's outstanding activists, Cornelia Collins Hussey, in a report to the American Woman Suffrage Association, also in 1875. Women once voted in New Jersey, but heedless of her high privilege, it was wrested from her, and man assumed the governing power as the true prerogative of his sex. Thus, in our state, a system of class legislation superseded a truly Republican form of government. I'd say don't mess with Cornelia Hussey. The nation marked 100 years since the Declaration of Independence with an elaborate international exposition in Philadelphia. By 1876, the movement for women's suffrage was divided. Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell on one team, based by then in Boston, pitted against Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in the other, nominally based in New York. The Stone-Blackwell team led the American Woman Suffrage Association, committed at that time to gaining votes for women one state at a time. Stanton and Anthony led the National Woman Suffrage Association, about to commit itself to a federal constitutional amendment. There was no cooperation of these groups to honor the centennial. The rivals headed to Philadelphia and held separate events. The American Association called a public meeting with morning and afternoon sessions in Horticultural Hall on the fairgrounds for July 3rd, 1876. They would gather, according to the call, quote, in grateful remembrance of the adoption of the principle of equal political rights for women by the province of New Jersey. They were using the 3rd because that year, July 2nd fell on a Sunday, couldn't hold their meetings then. There were speeches in Horticultural Hall, and the speeches were reported in Stone's weekly newspaper, the Woman's Journal. An excerpt from Henry Blackwell's speech is typical of the celebratory tone. The declaration only announced the principle that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. But the men of New Jersey applied the principle alike to women and Negroes. It was the prophecy and the guarantee of our national future. Within months, we pulled the federal troops out of the South, ending the voting rights of blacks in the South, and it wasn't a great forecast, prophecy, and guarantee. But the tone, it's more important than the Declaration of Independence. They were using this like a pep rally. They were encouraging whatever audience came. People had come to the city for the fair, lots of things to be entertained by, and they might have come by the Horticultural Hall to hear these speeches. Never underestimate how divided the suffragists were in the 1870s. Here is Elizabeth Cady Stanton reacting to that event. We can't tell if she actually sat in the back and heard it, but she was writing a letter to a friend written from Philadelphia on July 5th, so 2 days after the meeting. The meeting did not create a ripple on the surface, she says. It was cold, barren, and unprofitable. The press scarcely noticed it. They celebrated the 3rd because the women of New Jersey had once voted and were then robbed of the privilege. Was there ever anything so absurd? Everybody said, what a stupid idea and what a stupid meeting. Within the state, the history shaped strategy. The memory of their lost Republican government influenced how New Jersey suffragists stated their purpose. And here, keep in mind that though this year we have been celebrating a federal solution to women's suffrage, for more than 7 decades, women in each state and territory sought a local solution. usually by seeking to amend their state constitution. And here are some passages from a memorial, one example, to the legislature adopted by the State Suffrage Society in 1871. They refer to white male in the Constitution and says it is, among other things, quote, contrary to the precedent established by the founders of political liberty in New Jersey. The Act of 1807 was, in their words, a despotic ordinance. And when those restrictions were incorporated into the Constitution of 1844, it was, quote, plainly an act of usurpation and injustice and a flagrant wrong. And in conclusion, they wrote, it is evident to every reasonable mind that these unjustly disfranchised citizens should be reinstated in the right of suffrage. They should have their political liberty restored to all inhabitants. That's 1871. In 1884, at a hearing about woman suffrage before a special committee of the Assembly, Therese Walling Seabrook of Keyport thought to bring and display an ancient printed copy of the original Constitution of New Jersey, inscribed with the name of her husband's grandfather. She showed it, and then she made her speech. When the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association submitted a petition to the legislature in 1895, it was headed by a protest for women had voted in New Jersey until it was unconstitutionally taken from them in 1807. A month or so later, the state's top activists were in Plainfield to help women launch the Union County Women's Suffrage Association. In the room where old hands and newcomers mingled, the Reverend Antoinette Blackwell, now age 70, made certain that new activists understood the unique context of this work in New Jersey, that here women needed, in her words, to work for its restoration. It's like a rite of initiation. That this habit of mind and this view of history reached a dramatic climax early in the 20th century in an attempt, quite literally, to restore women's suffrage by challenging how it was taken away. On October 31st, 1911, Harriet Carpenter, a resident and a property owner in Passaic Township, asked to be registered to vote. So this is 40 years after Virginia Minor did that in St. Louis. The same tactic is being deployed. Officials at the Board of Registry and Elections refused her because she was a woman. She insisted that her request and their refusal be made a part of their official record, and they complied. Carpenter knew she needed documentation of their refusal because hers was a purposeful act designed by attorney Mary Philbrook to set up a test case in the state courts, 40 years after Virginia Minor started on the same journey in St. Louis. Philbrook filed for writ of mandamus from the state Supreme Court. That is, she asked the court to order the officials to perform their jobs and register Carpenter. And with that, the case of Carpenter v. Cornish began, Cornish being the lead name of all the men who had refused to register Carpenter. Philbrook was the first female admitted to the New Jersey bar. It had been a fight. Denied access to the bar exam in 1894 because she was a woman, she turned to the State Women's Suffrage Association for help. And together they pushed through a law the next year that permitted women to take the exam. Mary took it and aced it. For this fight over the Carpenter case, Philbrook took all the history and memory and passion of suffragists who had led the way and poured them into her brief and appeal, history and legal argument combined. So somewhere she's gotten that passion because she's not old enough to have been here through the whole 19th century. In reply, the highest courts in the state wrote a new history of what occurred between 1776 and 1807. Philbrooks was a simple argument that cleared away a lot of clutter. Everyone agreed that officials in Passaic acted under terms of the Constitution of 1844 that limited voting to white male citizens. Philbrook chose to argue that that Constitution was invalid, and here's why. At the time of drafting the 1844 text, the ruling Constitution was still that of 1776. The rules of 1776 should have established who voted for delegates to the new Constitutional Convention and who voted on whether to ratify it. Philbrook took the argument to a new place. Not only did the state unconstitutionally deprive inhabitants of the vote in 1807 by statute, it compounded the illegality by framing a new constitution without proper reference to the previous constitution. Justice Samuel Kalish, a Democrat appointed to the Supreme Court of New Jersey by Governor Woodrow Wilson, wrote the court's opinion delivered in April 1912. What you're seeing, the words that I've put next to this cartoon of Kalish are what's in this shield-shaped thing over the woman's head. I have a suspicion that this cartoon was drawn, Fleming was a newspaper cartoonist, that this cartoon may refer to this case. The references to the women make me think that's possible, but we don't have confirmation of that. So, but here's his new history of voting rights in New Jersey. The premises upon which this argument, that is Philbrooks, rests are inaccurate and fallacious. There is nothing in the Constitution of 1776 which confers on women the right to vote. Any privilege, and that's the end of his quote, any privilege women enjoyed in that long ago era derived from the legislative acts of the 1790s with their reference to he and she. Those were just laws, interpretations of constitutional language without the status of rights. As for the law of 1807, the legislature could reinterpret itself any time. There was nothing unusual about a legislature changing its mind. Note that the justice is drawing a distinction here previously used by William Whitehead between the constitutional language of 1776 and the laws of the 1790s, saying that it was the latter, not the former, that allowed women to vote. And to look back for a second to the Museum of the American Revolution exhibit, their earliest finds, according to their website, date to 1798. We still have problems with the evidence about the voting women of New Jersey. It might have been a good idea for the leading judge to stop right there when he's rewritten the history before 1807, but he had more history to rewrite using textual analysis. What did it mean on July 2nd, 1776, to say, as the Constitution's authors did, that to qualify to vote, the inhabitant must have resided within the county in which they claim a vote for 12 months immediately preceding the election. It was, he wrote, both plain and obvious that all inhabitants were expected to meet those standards in the first part and, quote, have been legal voters prior to the adoption of the Constitution. Quote, the term all inhabitants must be limited to those legally entitled to vote in this state before the adoption of the Constitution and who have qualified under it. Or in other words, in another part of his opinion, the Constitution dealt with the legal voter as then known and understood, and it was not intended to create a new and additional class of voters. Mary Philbrook appealed the decision to the Court of Errors and Appeals. There was a different sequence than we have now, where Justice Francis Swayze wrote the opinion. He explained that he would not review the Supreme Court's version of New Jersey history. Rather, he went first straight for Philbrook's claims about the illegal origins of the state constitution of 1844. Quote, "This contention has the distinction of being as courageous as it is novel." I'm pretty sure he wrote that with a smile. And he didn't stop there. He pointed out to the good counselor that without the Constitution of 1844 that she wanted to dismiss, the court to which she made this appeal would not exist. It was a creature of that Constitution. There's more to the story of the appeal, but the decision by the justices to leave history writing to the lower court rather quashed the historical memories that had so long sustained suffragists in New Jersey. I think it brought the era of efforts to restore rights to an end. Soon thereafter, New Jersey's women set out on their most serious mission to amend the state constitution of 1844. And lest you think that in the meantime, the men were getting more friendly, that effort on a referendum in 1915, women's suffrage was massacred. They didn't come close. Only in Ocean County did men vote yes on women's suffrage. With that, I think.
Thank you, Anne. That was fascinating. I'm always amazed at how many things I never have learned very much about prior. So this has been like a wellspring of really excellent information. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
We do have a question. Before we get there, there was one comment in the chat that someone had posted that they were thrilled to think that their Burlington County female ancestors had voted, which I think is a neat thing to think about, that there were these pockets of women who were able to do that at the time.
Yep.
So let's see, here's our question. They ask, can you say something about the Blackwell family and the parents of Henry Blackwell, husband of Lucy Stone, Emily Blackwell, first doctor, Emily Blackwell, third doctor, Samuel Blackwell, husband of Antoinette Brown Blackwell. I've always been intrigued that they were such active suffragists and would marry such strong women.
I'm not a great expert, and I could make a joke about how dare you ask me. I'm on the other team. I'm the editor of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's papers. It is a fascinating family. It's an odd one, and I think there must have been very great differences between them. I mean, Henry Blackwell is kind of a pompous jerk, and he's very loyal to the women's suffrage cause, but he invented mansplaining. And Lucy, it's not the world's greatest marriage as far as anybody can see. He's loyal to her, but she doesn't seem to be a very happy wife. She's got other things that hold her attention. Whereas Antoinette Blackwell, who married his brother, Antoinette had been Lucy's best friend at Oberlin, and then she also became a close friend of Susan B. Anthony's after she graduated. They used to do things together in upstate New York. But then she met one of the other Blackwell men, and Antoinette seems to be one of the happiest suffragists there was. She was also probably the leading scholar among them all, wrote books. She's one of the people who really takes Darwin seriously when that science comes in and begins to affect all forms of knowledge. So there must have been a big difference between them. But then you got the women They do hang together tightly. Elizabeth I think it's Elizabeth that goes back to London and is a doctor there, of the Blackwell women who become doctors. And she sends bad gossip about Stanton and Anthony back to her sister-in-law. Yeah, if they're English immigrants to the United States. And I don't know enough about that history. I can't remember things about their father. I think the father's a merchant of some sort, a storekeeper scale. But yes, you're absolutely right that it's a fascinating family with a whole range of women and men with unusual commitments and energies.
Excellent. We have a question. Thinking about the clause in the earlier Constitution requiring a certain amount of money to be qualified to vote. This discussed in the efforts to achieve the vote later. Did this come back?
Wait. So the money. What about the money? The money in this.
So it says, what about the clause in the early Constitution requiring a certain amount of money to be qualified to vote? Was this discussed in the efforts to achieve the vote?
By women. I mean, it's dropped in that, I think it's dropped in the 1807 law, actually, but it's definitely dropped in the 1844 Constitution. So that in a way, it's opening up that 1844 Constitution opens up the rights of, the privileges of citizenship to more people. While more white men who have their citizenship in a state where they are the minority, but even when they eliminate the property thing. So it's like, it's not quite a democratic revolution like we were taught in high school with the Jacksonian democracy. It's not quite pure like that. It's because it's clearly leaving out people on purpose.
Slightly building off of one of your other topics, we had a question about women lawyers, assuming women read to be a lawyer. When were women first admitted to law schools in New Jersey? Do you know that history?
I don't know. She did not go to law school. I know that. She had a job in law firms is the way she did it. I don't know the answer to that. When did we even get the law schools? That would be, I'm not even sure of that. And I don't think it's a bigger question too, which is I'm not sure when the transition happens, where the proportion of people going to school as opposed to reading law in a law office occurs, and it may occur different times in different places. I mean, in the 1840s, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband is learning law by studying with her father. There's no question of going to law school. That's how you did it. But I don't know when that shifts.
Okay. I see we have a couple of people who added questions to the chat. Is there anywhere a compilation of the names of women who voted in New Jersey at any time prior to the national suffrage amendment, or are they scattered? Do you know if there's a compilation?
I don't think there's a compilation unless the people in Philadelphia have put it together, because they've got more names than anybody's ever had before. Whether I know they're working on one of the exciting things they say they're going to do is they're actually researching these women. So they're going to be able to learn things about what was the property they had? Why were they eligible to vote? Just, they're finding any other public records they can that help them identify who these people are. And they say that's going to be a database that people can use. But other than that, no. And there's a complicated extra, because there's another period when some women got to vote on school budgets and school officials, and things, but that got taken away too in the 1890s. New Jersey might hold the record for taking votes away from women.
Let me see. We had someone who wanted to share some information as well in terms of the chronology. Looking at, they mentioned that 1844 was the first year that poor white farmers in Louisiana were allowed to vote for representation in the state legislature, and noted also that Yale University accepted women as students until about 1828, which was when they were excluded before, of course, being brought back in again. So adding to your chronology.
Well, and I think that's a history we don't, I'm not sure people are yet telling that they're thinking to write that way. That is, there really do seem to be waves of pushing women back and waves of letting them back in. After the Civil War, for example, oh, it's something, pushing women out of jobs. It's sort of like the Rosie the Riveter story, but in different parts of the economy and so forth. You pushing women back out of the job, mocking that they think they understand foreign affairs, not refusing to read their novels. Just, you see this happening, and I think there are probably ways that somebody could do some interesting cultural histories about. Do these Louisiana and New Jersey, do they really have this at the same time? That's a good question. We have to look at that.
That's a good challenge for our attendees out there. Getting your scholar hats on. I want to thank you, Anne, really again for this really excellent presentation. It's been so informative and so thought-provoking, and it's just been a real pleasure. Do you have any final closing tidbits that you wanted to share?
Well, one, as we're fighting over history in the present century, keep in mind that it's happened a lot and with real consequences. These are fights that matter, and they're old fights. That here are judges arguing about whether women voted 100 years earlier, and it matters to decisions that people are making. And it's the fight. It's not just us fighting. This week, the Tories in London had a whole thing about how we're not going to have history rewritten by those liberals. And they were off and running. So it's, there is a history that must be protected and saved, is their view. And that's not how it's usually worked.
There's one question in the chat that I think we missed, and someone has repeated it, asking about the etymology of the word suffrage and where it comes from and why we use that word to describe this right.
Oh, and I forgot to look it up. Is there anybody in the audience? I used to have it always with me when I gave lectures. Is there somebody in the audience who can remember what it is? It's an impossible word. When we were starting the first meetings for the National Archives Rightfully Yours exhibit, one of the first questions they asked the historians who were assembled was, what are we going to do about the word suffrage? Nobody knows what it means. And we said, oh, that's easy, get around it, call it voting rights. And then you also open up, the topic to be up to the present day, since we're still talking about voting rights. But the National Archives exhibitors knew they could not do an exhibit that was based on people understanding what suffrage meant. And I'm sorry that that I didn't bring that. Google it.
I did a quick Google.
Oh, you did? Okay.
It looks like it comes from the Latin suffragium, which means a voting tablet. It looks like it refers to the actual physical item that was used to cast a ballot. The word that describes that, and now it refers to the right to cast a ballot.
Excellent. And we did get, the moment you started reading it, someone in our did also top that in. So thank you to all of our participants for your full and active involvement in our presentation.
Yeah, that's
tonight.
one advantage of putting the world on Zoom is we all have, all our research little tricks and tools at our fingertips.
Very collaborative.
Yes, that's true.
Izzy, can I ask you to tell us just a little bit about what people can find with the Princeton Historical Society in terms of women's suffrage?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the very end of her presentation, Dr. Gordon mentioned that the fight for women's suffrage in New Jersey was not necessarily successful after the moments concluding her story about the memory of 18th century suffragists, and she referred to a 1915 referendum where voters were trying to get the state constitution amended to allow women the right to vote. So the exhibition that we have developed collaboratively with the public library really focuses on that story. Woodrow Wilson was president of the United States at the time, and his polling place was right here in Princeton. So there was a lot of interest, and reporters swarmed Princeton during this really important referendum fight because everyone wanted to know how Wilson would vote. He was known for being very cagey about how he felt about women's suffrage, though we know in his personal writings that he was opposed. And his first public statement about women's suffrage came in the lead up to this referendum, in which he casted, spoiler alert, he voted for it, but it made sure that everyone knew it was his personal opinion as a voter here in Princeton and not necessarily as the president of the United States. So there was a lot of interest in this referendum in New Jersey and in Princeton specifically, and we talked through in the exhibition all of the women and men in Princeton who were active in advocating for and against that referendum. So as Dr. Gordon said, we often think about 1920 as just this big year when it all happened, but there was so much that happened in the century leading up to that. And the big conversation in Princeton was in 1915. So that's what our exhibition is about. If you want to learn more about picking up where Dr. Gordon left off, literally. So it's a really nice segue. And we'll be doing a gallery talk about that exhibition, a virtual gallery talk about the research process and some of the stories that didn't quite make it on December 9th, I believe. December 9th, also collaboratively with the Princeton Public Library. So we should be posting more information about that soon. But we've been really excited to, at the beginning of 2020, we thought that the whole year was just all going to be all women's suffrage all the time. We didn't know that there would be a little bit of a distraction, but we're really glad to have Dr. Gordon, who is going to be our annual meeting speaker all the way back in March. So we really appreciate the patience and the perseverance. And for those of you who registered for that talk and came back with us this evening, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Gordon, for really fascinating story that you told us tonight. And I did want to flag up also a comment in the chat, the specific story about who voted and how in New Jersey, of the women voters of New Jersey, 1776 to 1807, is the subject of that Museum of the American Revolution special exhibition, which is open. And someone put in the chat that she did go and felt safe and felt like they were using some good social distancing and cleaning protocols. So if anyone wants to go and visit that, it is available now to go see.
And it's there till I think it's April 25th.
They extended it. Yeah, I believe you're right. Yeah.
And then there will be, as I said, a digital version of it, but there was no date at all on the website just yesterday. So maybe they don't know yet when they can finish it.
All right. Well, keep an eye out for that. Keep an eye out also on the library's event page for our upcoming talk with the Historical Society of Princeton. Again, you can find all of our information at princetonlibrary.org and all of Izzy's information at princetonhistory.org. We encourage you to please visit those sites and continue to spend your time with us as we explore more fascinating topics like this. And thank you again so much, and Izzy, for joining us tonight. And we will say our fond farewells.
And thank you for organizing this.
Excellent. Our pleasure. Thank you all for attending. Have a lovely night.